In the Americas, tipping culture is, without a doubt, the most debated social norm. What started as a generous practice that awards workers for going above and beyond in their work has become an unspoken obligation for consumers to help workers make up for their already mediocre wages. But how did tipping get this extreme? What have people done in response to how tipping culture is in modern-day America? And how is tipping approached outside of America? To answer those questions, we must first understand why tipping became an arguably exploitative social obligation in America.
I just want to say, it's a nice house for a $5 tip.
You're welcome.
An $8 tip.
What the hell are you looking for? I gave it $8.
Okay, I'm gonna bring the food back. I'm gonna bring the food back. Okay.
Thanks for the tip.
What?
Yeah, fuck you, bro.
What?
It's for her, dude. I didn't even order it.
Her, bro.
Dude, that's funny, bro. Really?
Yeah.
I didn't even order it.
I don't make fucking money if I don't get tipped.
Dude, I didn't
I
even
just
order it.
pizza with my guy, so you, man.
In the service industry, tipping is a common practice that many consumers do out of pure generosity to reward those who exceed their expectations after being served. Factors that warrant a tip from a consumer may include efficiency, the speed at which the service is provided, or the overall quality of the service. It's said that this influence first started in Europe, but it wouldn't be long before tipping would spread to the Americas. Tipping would become a significant practice that wealthy American settlers visiting the European continent would adopt and bring back to America during the Reconstruction era post-Civil War. However, despite Congress passing the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the mistreatment and biases against people of color were still very prominent across the nation, especially given its lack of economic justice, thus resulting in a tipping culture in a post-Civil War America with racial and economic undertones. Certain employers, commonly restaurant employers, would use tipping as a way to take advantage of their employees, freed slaves especially, to encourage consumers to tip to compensate workers for not being paid for the work they did, essentially putting the burden on the consumer in question. In other words, tips became a freed slave's necessity rather than a bonus for good service, since their employers would pay them little to nothing. They had to rely on the generosity of the consumer to compensate for the low wage, especially in the southern United States. This factor would become the primary cause and effect of how modern-day tipping culture is practiced in America, arguably the catalyst for the exploitative nature of tipping in modern-day America. As time went on and service industries expanded, tipping became more institutionalized in America, particularly in the 20th century after the Fair Labor Standards Act was established in 1938, which allowed workers to qualify for minimum wages and overtime pay. It would also limit businesses from allowing children to exceed a certain amount of hours they can work to squeeze in education time, alongside general safety reasons. Tipping would become influenced under the FLSA, especially in the Act's 1966 amendment, where a tip credit system would be introduced, allowing employers to reduce a worker's minimum wage so long as their earned tips cover that said lost wage. That is if you don't live in Alaska, California, Minnesota, Montana, Nevada, Oregon, and Washington, as the tip credits are banned in those particular states. The tip credit system in the United States is a double-edged sword. While it can benefit workers who are paid minimum wage, it can also be a major downside depending on how profitable the business in question is. Businesses outside the mentioned states would take advantage of it, and it became ingrained to the point where it was a way to cut down on labor costs and instead have the consumer be relied upon to compensate a worker's lost salary. Otherwise, employers would have to be inclined to pay workers more. This system would be a major contributing factor as to why tipping is heavily relied upon in many industries. Even though tipping is optional, it became an unspoken social norm to tip, even if the service is below average in quality. Restaurants and hospitality businesses in particular became two of the most common types of businesses for patrons to tip, since workers were the most underpaid in those industries in comparison to other businesses in America. There are many reasons as to why this is the case, but again, the tip credit system is a major factor. As a result, patrons would be inclined to tip due to the social pressure brought upon them because of how normalized it was to tip certain businesses. From a psychological standpoint, not tipping can evoke guilt and shame as patrons fear being judged or seen as unfair. This social pressure to tip reflects on how tipping has shifted from voluntary generosity to an assumed moral obligation. In other words, the responsibility of giving workers better pay is brought upon consumers to comply with with social norms despite a worker's lack of pay not being the fault of the patron. These behaviors are influenced by others who feel obligated to tip to help out workers who aren't being paid enough for the work they do. Thus, this would make tipping an expectation if one were to dine at a restaurant, for example. Moreover, workers would be compelled to blame patrons for not tipping, which only reinforced the psychological social pressure of shame to be brought upon the consumer. Not tipping became a way to signal workers that the work done was not up to their standards, even if that's not the case most of the time, and thus was a punishment for those workers in question, an unspoken statement from customers who were dissatisfied with the service they received. This created a sense of entitlement for workers as the base pay wasn't good enough and would make them more worthy of tips to compensate for the arguably lousy base pay. Many businesses, especially in the restaurant industry, would keep prices low knowing that consumers would be inclined to tip for the service provided to them, and this method would allow sales and profit to flourish significantly. A good example of this method can be taken from the modern food delivery services like DoorDash, Uber Eats, or Grubhub. While service fees on those apps vary, they're usually around the 10 to 15% of the subtotal of an order. Delivery fees are also a factor in these apps, but to sum it all up, the amount a delivery driver earns from these apps simply isn't enough for a reliable wage. Thus, tipping is heavily encouraged before, during, and after you order something on these apps. Tips are relied upon and are heavily pushed to compensate the employees. Ultimately, tipping can be seen as a vicious cycle of psychological manipulation that transpired so businesses could avoid paying extra labor expenses that come with running a business and making more money by doing less. And because of this, society sees tipping as a mandatory, especially in North America where the economy is arguably shaky at best. With everything previously mentioned in mind, we can see examples of how heavily tips from consumers are relied upon to cover one's low salary in modern day society. One example is how electronic payments with a debit card will now often prompt the person paying to leave a tip, which usually ranges from 15 to 25%. Some businesses will even take matters into their own hands and try their hardest to remove the option of not giving a tip, like covering up the no tip option with tape and paper on the card reader, essentially forcing the consumer to leave a tip even though tipping is entirely voluntary. It can be inferred that businesses that deceive consumers like this only show their desperation to keep labor costs low. With all this in mind, it's no secret that many people aren't very fond of how tipping is practiced in America, and how it has become an unspoken requirement when buying certain goods or services. Many have taken it upon themselves to protest and make their voices heard, and to let businesses know how they feel about tipping. For instance, many establishments would restrict tipping altogether, and instead focus on paying their employees a decent wage by raising prices to shift the responsibility of paying the employees to the employers rather than through malicious means through consumers, and to promote equity among all employees. However, movements would soon arise the more ingrained tipping would become, with the goal of advocating for fair wages without having to rely on tips to earn decent pay. On November 29th, 2012, a crowd consisting of 200 fast food employees banded together in New York City to protest and go on strike, going against their low pay to increase their pay to $15 an hour. This movement would be known as the Fight for $15. Upon the movement gaining some traction through news outlets and general word of mouth, it resulted in a lot of big corporations such as Walmart, Amazon, and McDonald's raising their pay for employees up to $15 an hour or more. However, a lot of people complain about not receiving enough tips. As previously mentioned, delivery drivers on apps such as DoorDash, Grubhub, Uber Eats, and others do not make a livable wage. While it can be argued that being a dasher is a side hustle instead of an actual job, it's still considered to be a job by many, as you need little to no experience to become a dasher, aside from having a driver's license. Despite this, they may express frustration when they receive a considerably low tip, sometimes acting unprofessionally by delaying deliveries or even tampering with orders. This behavior can be seen in social media content and highlights consumer concerns about the consequences of not tipping. Searching tip rage or something along those lines on YouTube or any other social media site will allow you to come across a plethora of videos of delivery drivers complain about how much they were tipped, with them even going out of their way to insult the person they delivered to. While it's obviously against many delivery apps' guidelines to do unprofessional things like this over receiving small tips, it doesn't stop some delivery drivers from acting out over not receiving a decent tip, which reinforces how desperate some people are for that extra bit of income. Tipping in America has, without a doubt, become so saturated and enforced on society that it's become a mandatory requirement for efficient and fast services, rather than a way to reward workers for exceeding expectations. But with all that in mind, it calls into question how other countries perceive tipping. Well, in some countries like Japan, for example, it's considered rude to tip an employee because of how different the culture is in comparison to America. It's considered a distasteful gesture to tip in Japan because many workers are already earning enough from their jobs, and tipping would not only make it awkward given its roots in something called omotenashi, which is essentially the priority of looking after the consumer to ensure that the service is exceptional. With this cultural norm in mind, it can be considered unusual or rude to tip because it can come across as the consumer finding the service mediocre. On top of this, service fees are included in most prices in Japan, so the act of tipping becomes redundant since the worker is already earning enough. Thus, tipping can be seen as disrespectful to a lot of Japanese workers. In other places like Ireland and Denmark, however, tipping is more so customary to round out the cost of certain services. It's not expected by others, but it is the norm for a lot of people. Finally, there are countries such as Vietnam that see tipping as an obligation, depending on certain attributes like the quality of the service, the location, or the occasion. Now, to conclude, what started as a way to reward workers for their excellence in the service devolved into a social obligation to avoid repercussions given by a worker. In comparison to other cultures, tipping is seen much differently, with most learning toward the convenience factor of the practice. Many can say that the United States by far has the most tipping out of any country, and with inflation continuing to rise over time, the absurdness and social norms will only become more prevalent and more ingrained than they already are. When you dig deep into it, it's clear to see just how exploitative tipping culture in the Americas can be. While tipping originated with good intentions, its current form reveals quite an exploitative practice, thus leaving many to question its place in a fair and balanced economy.